Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Nordenberg. I'm a former chancellor of the university, a former dean of this law school. In fact, there was an earlier period in my life when I spent a lot of time in this courtroom, so it's nice to come back home. I currently have the privilege of chairing the Institute of Politics and serving as director of the Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy, and it is in those roles that I welcome all of you today. And when I say all of you, I do mean those who have gathered here in the Teplitz Memorial Courtroom, and an equally large number who are joining us through the live stream. If you remember from your program, there are a lot of academic units of the university who are listed as co-sponsors of this event, and we're grateful to them all for the help that they provided. The Institute of Politics and the Dick Thornburgh Forum are listed as co-presenters with the Center for International Legal Education. We don't deserve that billing. I need to say from the start that this is a program that really has been launched and shaped by the Center for International Legal Education. And so the lion's share of the credit belongs to CILE, to Ron Brand, its founding and currently academic director, and to Professor Charles Katubi, who is the executive director and who played the biggest role in recruiting the ambassador to this program today. The Center for International Legal Education is approaching its 30th anniversary, which is hard for me to believe since I was there in a manner of speaking at the beginning. But over the course of those 30 years, it really has grown into a unit that enjoys global respect for its accomplishments and its impact. I had lunch with Professor Brand yesterday, and I left exhausted just listening to all of the things that he had recently done during his travels to the Middle East, to the Balkans, and to other parts of Europe. It included interactions with students, faculty, alums, a brief excursion to do some treaty negotiations on behalf of the State Department. As far as I could tell, the only relaxing time he had was when he was served a home-cooked meal by the president of Kosovo, who came to Pitt and Pittsburgh through the Center for International Legal Education, and who we now proudly claim as one of our graduates. Though I think Professor Katubi rarely is in one place for very long himself, he did manage to keep the home fires burning, and as I indicated, most importantly today, he played the key role in arranging for the appearance of Ambassador David Carden, who Professor Katubi has described as a walking think tank. So you better buckle up and get ready to follow these ideas. Let me extend a warm welcome to you, Mr. Ambassador, even while I relinquish the podium to Jerry Dickinson, a long-time and highly respected member of the law faculty, who quite recently was named dean, and who already is making a difference in the school. Jerry?
Great. Thank you, Mark, for those wonderful introductory remarks. And thank you so much for being here today. And it is an absolute honor, a pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on reimagining the architecture of democracy with Ambassador David Carden. And before we begin, I wanted to extend my sincere thanks to our co-hosts, the Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy, of course, the Center for International Legal Education, Pitt Cyber Center for the Governance and Markets, and the Frederick Honors College as well for making this event possible. And a special thanks, of course, to Professor Chuck Katubi, who will be moderating today's discussion. Those who may not know, Chuck and I, we share an affinity as former Division I soccer players. He was a center back, and I too was, although he went to Pitt and played at Pitt. And so that's a little nugget of information that he doesn't say very often, but Chuck has been an amazing, colleague and leader here at the law school, and really has just done extraordinary things to expand Pitt Law's global reach. And so, Chuck, thank you for all that you do for this law school and for this university. And of course, I want to recognize Chancellor Emeritus Mark Nordenberg. Thank you so much for all that you do, Mark. I feel like we have spoken at the same events so often this semester that I feel like you are angling to become the next dean after me. But thanks so much for your leadership and mentorship. We do appreciate all that you do here at the law school and the university. And of course, thanks to Ron Brand for all that you do. It's good to have you back in the country. I know you were doing your globetrotting, but thank you for all that you do for the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. This conversation today, it comes at a pivotal moment in our country's history. Just last week, I had the opportunity, of course, with Chancellor Emeritus Nordenberg to speak about the sort of state of democracy and the Constitution with Harry Litman. And now, today, just a week later, we're excited to build on those remarks, on those topics, on those themes, and expand our lens beyond the United States and looking at democracy's evolution on a global scale. And as I mentioned last week, and I'll note here, my approach has always been to view democracy and its endurance through sort of the lens of constitutional resilience and how our system is shaped by past crises and has withstood war and economic upheaval and shifting cultural and social movements. And it does remain the sort of foundation of American governance. Ambassador Carden today offers a different, yet I think complementary perspective. And I think that is one that in many ways challenges us to think beyond national borders and consider democracy's broader architecture, sort of the scaffolding, the architecture around democracy globally, and how economic forces and global governance and institutional design shape democratic stability. Ambassador Carden is uniquely positioned, and you'll hear this today with his remarks, to lead this discussion. He was the first resident U.S. ambassador to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, a political and economic union of 10 Southeast Asian countries. And he played an absolute critical role in shaping the U.S. engagement in that region. You just have to do a Google search and you'll see extraordinary work on the part of Ambassador Carden during his time in the Obama administration. And it doesn't stop there. I mean, we're talking about working across the White House. We're talking about working across the State Department, the Department of Defense. And he is someone who has been strengthening diplomatic and economic ties in one of the world's most dynamic political landscapes. But I think it's also important to note here that his experience extends far beyond just diplomacy. And for the lawyers in this room, Ambassador Carden is a former partner at Jones Day, co-chair of the Securities, Litigation, and SEC enforcement practice, and led the firm's office's Asia practice and efforts. His experience in cross-border disputes, regulatory frameworks, and the intersection of law and policy gives him this sort of, I think, arguably unparalleled perspective on how democracy is shaped by both institutions and by markets. And so today, I think in many ways, he remains a leading voice on these issues, contributing to publications all across the world and the United States, offering us up his expertise and his knowledge on these issues. And so, as I mentioned, while my work has sort of centered on how constitutional structures provide stability, Ambassador Carden's work approach challenged us to think more broadly, all right, to consider how democracy evolves in response to global forces, how informed groups shape governance, and how economic and institutional change can either strengthen or, as we'll hear, erode democratic systems. And with that, I am honored to introduce Ambassador David Carden, and I look forward to this conversation ahead. And so please join me in welcoming Ambassador Carden.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you to my host for inviting me to come. And most especially, thanks to all of you for coming, and those online as well. I had a rule in Southeast Asia that I would not speak without young people in the room, unless it was a diplomatic conversation, which they weren't admitted. They always set them in the back. And I often encounter situations where people would say certain things can't be done, and I would say to the people who said such things, tell them that. My role in all of this is, I don't want to say near an end in some respects, but my thoughts of this are still evolving, and I need all of you in order to understand what it is that I think. It's a pretty big topic, reimagining the architecture of democracy. Sometimes that means we simply need to remember things, and we need to return to them. One of my favorite poets, Wendell Berry, did a manifesto for farmers in which he said, practice resurrection. And in some respects, I think that is the operant concept right now. Pittsburgh is an interesting place to have that conversation because it is a place which has been resurrected from what it once was. The leadership that has been shown here is very important to remember, and it's changed dramatically. It was industrial leadership, and then it became healthcare and other sectors. But it's a remarkable transformation, although with some pretty serious changes as well, which were not all positive, perhaps. I woke up this morning wondering what I could say to you today that would be useful. I always prepare remarks, but I don't usually deliver them. The State Department, by the way, required me always to have written remarks to be submitted for approval, and in the hundreds, if not thousands of times that I've spoken, I never did. It wasn't because I was being impish or presumptuous. It's because I really didn't know what needed to be said or what I thought would be useful without entering into the room to whom I was speaking. So this morning what I did, I should say, by the way, I'm always nervous when I talk. And I'm nervous because I care. Anybody who isn't nervous when they talk, in my view, doesn't care. And I care deeply about this. There's a lot of reasons why that's true, why I spent 3 days of my life to come here. Felt like 3 years. It's hard to get anywhere anymore. I'm not getting paid to be here. I don't need the adulation and the praise. I'm here for you. I'm not here for me. Now, I don't mean to be presumptuous about that, because if I'm here for you, that means I have to have some sense of who you are. And so this morning I awakened and I spent some time walking around outside. I first tried to get in the cathedral, and not surprisingly, it was locked. Maybe not a problem, really, in some ways. And then I went into the Cathedral of Learning, where I sat at one of the tables and played with some of the things I might say, tried to have a few deep thoughts. It's a good place for that. But ultimately, it didn't really do much for me in terms of what I might say to you today. And so I stepped outside and I looked up, and I'd seen it from my room, but I didn't really know what it was. I saw the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. Now, it's not for nothing that the Soldiers and Sailors Monument is a copy, or what's thought to be a copy, of the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The Mausoleum of Halicarnassus was done in Asia Minor by architects that actually borrowed that architecture from somewhere else, a place called Lycia, doesn't matter. But they took it from somebody else. They borrowed that, which is an interesting thing because a mausoleum in many ways is the most important building of one's life, and they borrowed that from somewhere else. The reason it captured my attention is because of something that I want to begin with today, and that is I walk, sometimes 10 miles a day, sometimes further. This morning I wasn't able to do very much, but I walk, and I walk because, as it turns out, you're more creative when you walk. Stanford has done a study on this in 2014 that says you're 40 or 50% more creative. How they measure this, I have no idea, and I'm not responsible for that. They say you're 40% less analytical. And normally in our society, we think that's a problem. I tend not to think that's a problem myself. Somebody's asked me how I'm going to manage the next 4 years or however long it might be, and I said I'm going to practice radical hospitality and radical creativity. Those are the two things that I think are going to get me through. I also got my law license back 3 weeks ago. It was always there. I just needed to pay some money. It wasn't a hard problem. Why do I start there? When I was little, I grew up in a small place called Speedway, Indiana, in a house that was about twice as big as that jury box. And the one thing about that place that I most remember, I remember almost everything about that house, is that starting at about age 4 or 5, I could walk out the front door, and I could walk down the street, and I could walk into any house that I wanted to. And they knew who I was. I could have meals there. I could go to the bathroom. Once they even took me to the hospital when I cut myself. It was a neighborhood, a place where people knew each other, were committed to each other, understood who one another was. It's something that we've lost. I've lived in about 25 different places now, and I've never had that kind of neighborhood feel anywhere else. But I could walk in that neighborhood starting at about age 4. I couldn't cross the street. That was the rule until I got older. And we followed rules then as a child, and so I would walk up and down that street. It was such a strange place that there was one young child that had sleptwalked. And he would end up in everybody's house. He'd wake up and he'd be in our couch. It was that kind of place. It was a place that was built after the war where the men who came back, and they mostly were men, had seen the world and brought that back with them. They were joiners. They joined things, Kiwanis and all kinds of clubs. They worked together. They built a community. So walking has always been something that has been important to me, and that made me think, as I walked around today, about some of the Greek architecture that exists on campus. And first place I ever traveled at age 20 was Athens, Greece. I went to study philosophy. I've forgotten most of that. I've got a philosopher in the room. I got to be careful. And so it's the first time I fell in love. By the way, if you think I'm not talking about the reimagining democracy, you're mistaken, okay? And we're going to get there. Please trust me just a little bit. I fell in love in Athens, or thought I did. And being a little awkward, a little young, even though it was the 1960s, we walked in the city endlessly. And we created a project for ourselves. We wanted to find Aristotle's Lyceum. Now, Aristotle's Lyceum had gone missing. Plato's Academy has been known where it was forever, but the Lyceum went missing. I didn't care about the Academy for reasons that we'll come to in a moment. I cared about the Lyceum. I cared about Aristotle. All of this sort of was evocative in some respects of, and this may be something you find a little peculiar, but my walking in Speedway, Indiana, and we had a place called Ithaca. It wasn't a real place, it was an imaginary place. The Hawaiian Islands, Ithaca, we had all these places as children that we would visit. And so when I went to Greece, I was, of course, real focused on Odysseus and the walking that he did, the travel that he did. And I want to just put a pin in this right now. The thing that Odysseus did in the 20-odd years that he traveled, he returned home to fight the suitors. Remember this in the story? And the story we led to believe is that he was so strong that he overcame all the suitors. That isn't what happened. Not to my way of thinking, anyway. He overcame the suitors because he was not the same man he was when he left. The root of the word Odysseus, by the way, is hate. Odium. It comes from the same root. Odysseus returned home, having spent 10 years with Calypso in love, She gave him the possibility of immortality, which he declined, to go home. When Odysseus came home, he came home a changed man. He wasn't the same person as when he left. I wasn't the same person that I was in Speedway, having gone where I went. I'm not the same person tomorrow that I am right now because I'm with all of you. That's just the fact, if I'm paying attention. If I'm paying attention. A lot of people aren't paying attention right now. So Martin Heidegger points this out in Being and Time. He says, Odysseus, the evolution of being, is Odysseus coming back changed. Now, he brought part of him, his old self, with him, okay? That's the remembering part. And he won. He created a new world. We don't hear what that world was very much, but when I was in Athens walking around with this first woman I thought I loved, we were trying to create a world. And what were we doing? What was the one thing we were doing? We were going out into the world. We were going into the world to learn the world in order to make a world for ourselves. Aristotle talks about this in terms of in the politics. He talks about democracy in the following ways. He says many things about democracy. I think you ought to reread it. But the two things that he says that stands out is, one, inductive reasoning based on data trumps deduction any day of the week. Now you got to deduce some things. Who's up north in Athens deducing things or basically thinking everything's top down? That's Plato. But Aristotle does something different. He goes into nature and he looks. One thing about walking that is so compelling, and the reason that Stanford said that it is why we are more creative, is the mathematics of the world we see. It's full of fractals. It's full of those repeating patterns that are in all of us and in our brain. It takes us into the world in a way that we recognize and we learn new things. So Aristotle is saying you've got to go into the world. You've got to find the facts. You've got to take those facts and create the world you want to create. He also said something else. He said that if you're going to have a democracy that survives, or a monarchy for that matter, you've got to share the economics. You cannot oppress people economically. You have to be fair about that. So let's take those two things for today's talk. Just those two things. Here we have a man that's prepared to enter into the world to learn it. The same way I entered into the world this morning in Pittsburgh to try to understand a little bit about this place, this new place for me. I've been to Pittsburgh, but never on this campus. And I remembered all those things this morning as I thought what I would say about walking up and down that street when I was a child. So, to the young people here, let's talk about these things. Who knows the last time that the minimum wage was changed in this country? Any hands? Okay, we got 2009. Went from, I think, $6.65 to 70 cents higher. You do the math, $7.35. In 1979, the top 1% of Americans had 7% of the country's wealth. In 2012, 20%. 1% of Americans had 20% of America's wealth. Today, 2024, the top 1% of the Americans, and you're probably got some family members in that, 30.8% of the wealth. Almost 1/3 of the country's wealth owned by the top 1%. Now, we hear all kinds of things about inequality being caustic and problematic and all that. Aristotle was talking about it in the 4th century BC about how it is ruinous with regard to democracy. How you cannot sustain a democracy if you have that level of inequality, and we have just let it happen. And it's not, by the way, just the Republicans. It's everybody's been responsible for this. Now, to their credit, Democrats have tried to change the minimum wage, but the minimum wage doesn't even begin to touch this, okay? First off, most people don't make minimum wage, about 15% in the country. What's really happened is that 80% of all Americans since 1980, 80% of all Americans in, I'll call it the working bracket, they've seen a real income increase of 7%. The other 20%, 300+%. The CEOs and all that, a totally different number. We've let that happen. Why? Why do we do that? It started it started with the tax changes in the 1960s, and then it accelerated in the 1980s with Reagan tax changes. That's the first question. Right now, we are looking at our challenges in democracy and saying, oh, people aren't getting together, people don't understand each other, people aren't entering into one of those worlds. All true, true, true. Voter suppression, rule of law challenges, all true. But the thing that's underneath it all, fundamentally is economics, in my view. And if you're going to change the architecture of democracy, you've got to do something about the economic inequality, and we're going the other direction as fast as you can get there. And the current administration, in terms of what they're trying to do economically, is going to make it worse. To anybody, forget what you think about it. Maybe you're going to gain from it personally. I'll be richer. Maybe. The tariffs are a little bit, Who knows what? We'll come back to the tariffs in a moment, maybe. Maybe not. Okay, so that's one thing that Aristotle's talking about. What's the other thing that is critical, that is sort of this, I'll call it a foundational issue? Ideas, data, facts, the things from which you can induce probabilities or possibilities about what's true and what's not. Very Aristotelian. It drove the scientific method. That is the scientific method. What's under attack now, by the way? Anybody surprised by this? Do you think these two things are disconnected in some way, the economics and the ideas or the facts? I don't think they're disconnected. We sit here trying to say, why are they doing that? Why are they attacking science? Forget for a moment that it wasn't until the Enlightenment that science came off the mat. We can have a long conversation about that if you want. But science is fundamentally problematic for any democracy. Facts, things from which you induce probabilities, from which you make policies. If you want a top-down control of things, you don't want somebody saying, oh, you can't do that. That's a problem, You'd rather have to say, well, only I can solve this. I'll take this burden off of you. There are all kinds of governments around the world, one of which we were talking about just a moment ago, I won't mention, in which they say they can fix it all. Just leave it to us. We'll make a nice life for you. Well, again, Aristotle said, it doesn't work out very well. Doesn't work out very well. If you want that kind of life, go up to the academy, which he studied at for quite a long time before he created the Lyceum. By the way, I should have mentioned, they found the Lyceum finally in 1996, and I was close. It was, people knew where it was, and it was along the Ilias River, and the reason I was close is because I knew where the river was. It's underground now. But the thing about that is interesting. It turns out the Lyceum was connected to the Temple of Apollo. Temple of Apollo Lycaeus, Apollo the wolf. What connected them? An arcade called the Peripatus. And so Aristotle and his philosophers were called peripatetics. And they're always shown, walking around with their robes on and the like. So even then, they understood entering into another world, moving, coming close, all of that is what connects us. So, let's go back for a moment to the attack on ideas, the attack on facts. Why are people tolerating it? That's really the pivotal question. Is the fear so great or the anger so intense that the elites, part of it is anger, part of it is the anger about the economics, as well there should be. So part of it is anger, part of it is future fear. Going back to the Temple of Apollo, Apollo was the god of poetry. I count that to be the present, and prophecy, the future. Well, you know, you need to be present in order to find the future, if you can, and Apollo is connected to Aristotle, in my view, for that reason and many other reasons. That's why they were located, co-located. Going back to the idea of why people are tolerating this, they want instantaneous democracy. They want somebody to say, I can fix it for you, I can solve the unfairness, I can solve your suffering, I can solve it right now. You know who's in the way? The legislature's in the way, the courts are in the way, deliberative processes. We don't need the deliberative processes. That's exactly what Aristotle said we needed to have in order to get to the truth. And I will tell you, by the way, most of us in our personal lives, you know, we give it a thought or two in terms of deciding what we want to do. We don't simply like pull it out of the air. Oh, I can just wing it here, not on the important stuff. So instantaneous democracy is what many, many people want. Now, it's odd to call it democracy, perhaps, but it still looks like democracy on the surface, doesn't it? We elect somebody, and then they say, well, we don't need the legislature. They deliberate. They take too long. And by the way, a lot of the criticism of democracy right now in a fast-paced world is it takes too long to do things. And therefore, you need to come up with things quite quick, much more quickly to solve these challenges. Some truth to that, but only because, and Aristotle talked about this as well, only because politicians and their desire for power brings them wealth and makes them corrupt. They're not entering into the conversation about what to do about things honestly. They're simply trying to maintain their own positions. Is this sounding familiar? Okay, this was 2,300 years ago. Reimagining, remembering, returning, resurrecting. It's all kind of there in the history of democracy and how we got here, with some major things in the middle like the Enlightenment, which we won't have time to talk about today. So the thing that is problematic about this instantaneous democracy is obvious, but it's also something that has been recognized for quite a long while. And you know who recognized it? It's going to be interesting to see whether they remember they recognized it. That's the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, for the lawyers amongst you, the Rumley case, I used to be a lawyer. I used to do some constitutional stuff too. The Rumley case, William Douglas, first case in which they really kind of talk about, I'll call it the marketplace of ideas, and how important they are to democracy, how critical they are. And then the Brandenburg case, when they first used the phrase, the marketplace of ideas. We need a marketplace of ideas in order for there to be a democratic conversation. We're losing that. We're losing that because that, at the end of the day, takes the authority out of the omnipotent ones who can only fix it themselves and basically injects into the conversation real thought and deliberation. And then, of course, sadly, and ironically, Citizens United, which claimed that the marketplace of ideas had to include corporations. Of course, I mean, that's what could be more obvious than that. But the idea about the marketplace of ideas is a powerful one. And Oliver Wendell Holmes said, Thomas Jefferson said, we don't have to worry about those people thinking crazy things as long as we've got some people able to call it out because they have access to the information they need to say that's just wrong. So what's happening now? Attack on education? Well, you don't need to know anything. You know, we don't care that you're not educated. Attack on facts? Attack on anything that would ultimately inform the electorate, and for that matter, inform the Congress. What do we do about this? Well, I got a few ideas. It's not fair to talk about these things and not have a few ideas. How much time do I have? I usually know this. 15. Oh, good. We might have to come back to some of the stuff I've been skipping over. The first and foremost thing we have to do is somehow inject back into the conversation that democracy isn't about, or just about, voting rights and rights. It's about ideas. What's happened when we've lost neighborhoods is we've made identity more important. It stands to reason, doesn't it? I mean, if you've got a neighborhood, I mean, I grew up with all kinds of people who we would call today in minority groups of one kind or another. Disabled. Some people had polio and were crippled. Some people were cognitively impaired, seriously. It was all mainstream. Everybody was in school together. We didn't think about ourselves in any kind of individual identity sense. I mean, I'm sure there was some of that, but mostly it was just we were part of Speedway. We were part of our street. But now, as things have eroded in terms of our connections with each other, we've enhanced our participation in, our identification with certain minorities. Even I did it. I thought for a while I was part Native American. See, right there in my family tree, Basil Prather and a full-blooded Cherokee squaw, 1760, Maryland. I thought, okay, you know, I can make that work, right? I mean, I'm not just a white guy. I mean, I've got this in me. And then I had my genetics done, and it's not there. And so I'm a little disappointed. I still sometimes say, well, you know, the genetics could have it wrong. And I was able to grab a little Lebanese in my genetic makeup. I've got 3% Lebanese. No, that came back. But it's interesting. We really want to think of belonging. Heraclitus said something, going back to Heidegger. When Heidegger talked about Odysseus coming back a changed man, he talked about Heraclitus, and you probably remember you can't step in the same river twice or whatever, the change that happens. Well, Heraclitus said, no one wants to be invisible. And we have created a world in which it's very, very easy to find yourself unseen. Sometimes you want to not be seen, understandable. But mostly people need to be seen. And the only way to be seen is we're prepared to enter into one another's worlds, right? To ask the name of the barista person, or to ask the name of the guy who's running the camera today. And to be part of all that. And for those of you who are online, Zooming, who are within 5 minutes of here, shame on you. You know? Shame on you. I mediate, by the way, from time to time. I'm interested in that. I'm going to probably do more of it now. It's one of my mechanisms for managing the next few years. And I'm very, not insistent, but desirous of them being in-person mediations. But I'm getting a lot of pushback on that. We got to be really careful about not entering into one another's world. It's not just yes, it's inconvenient for those of you online. I understand that. But we have to inconvenience ourselves for one another. So anyway, the first thing we might do is reestablish the connection between democracy and ideas and the deliberative process, the inductive process based on data that Aristotle talked about, you know, in the 4th century BC and follows all the way through. And instead we're talking about rights, and we're talking about rule of law, and we're talking about lawsuits. And don't mistake me, I understand all that. That's all correct. You don't leave those out of the equation, but I want to talk about ideas. And it's not because I'm some elitist or think that ideas are all that matter. What else do we need? We need a core of investigative journalists, investigators that are basically public interest investigators funded by members of the public who are going to tell us what is going on in Congress now, or any place else. who are a go-to place for some confident, some place where information is such that we can be confident in its objectivity. It might not be right, but it's a separate body, and it has to be funded by us. Public interest lawyers. I got my law license back. You know what's happening right now, you may read the papers, and I don't care what your politics are, by the way. That's not what I'm here to talk about today, but what I'm saying is, I want the conversation. I want the discussion. I don't want to see law firms that can't go into court because they're terrified of doing so. I don't want to see a situation where people don't have the facts. I will debate anybody on all sets of facts. I want all the facts, or what are thought to be the facts. I'm prepared to have that conversation. Why aren't you? Why do you want to put your finger on the scale? Well, we know why. So we need lawyers that can sally forth with their own funding that can basically try to protect the public interest. It seems to me pretty obvious that we ought to fund those people. Right now, I got my law license back, as I've already referenced more than once, but I don't have any malpractice insurance. Now, that's a problem, okay? I've gotten this far, and the attack on lawyers is intense right now. So they're trying to intimidate us. You know the famous quote from the German theologian during the Nazi period. You know, I was there when they came after the labor unions. You know, I was there when they came after the students. I was there when they came after a whole long group. I was there when they came after the Jews. I was there when they came after me and there was nobody left. I'm feeling a little bit that way right now. But it all goes back to the fact they're trying to control the conversation. This has happened before. It happened, obviously, in Nazi Germany. We talk a lot about that. I want to give you one interesting instance where this happened, which you may never have heard of before. The leading geneticist in the world in the 1930s was a guy named Vavilov. And Vavilov was in the Soviet Union. You might have guessed that. And Lenin thought he was the key to the Soviet Union's future. Genetics, particularly in the agricultural sector. Lenin died, and Stalin was concerned about Vavilov. And the reason he was is because Vavilov was arguing it was a survival of the fittest situation when it came to genetics. This did not square with the political notion that Stalin had of, that it's not survival of the fittest. It was inconsistent with what he thought the political realities, well, not the political realities, what he wanted the narrative in the Soviet Union to be. So we replaced Vavilov with a clown named Lyshenko, who's had, I think, a BA in biology. They put Vavilov in jail. He died in a year, starved to death. Alexander Sakharov says that as a result of that change, 5 million Russians starved to death because they had all the crop failures. By the way, Lyshenko's on the rise in Russia right now. He's back a hero. So the instances of what's happening aren't just here. They're in things like, look it up, Google Russia and Lyshenko right now, and you'll see articles saying Lyshenko, he was a great hero. Nobody remembers the 5 million dead people because nobody reads history anymore and all that sort of thing. So we're going through our list of things we might do. Well, one second. I did make some notes. I didn't want you to think I didn't care. Oh, yeah. There used to be something, a concept, still is a concept, but there used to be places that were called third places. Third places are places where you gather. So when I walked around this morning, and I was in the Soldiers and Sailors building, holds 2,500 people. I was in the student union, one room after another, and here, this space. Nobody was in them except here. That's okay. I mean, I got the sense that people did come from time to time. The third places we used to have, I remember those in my life, right? Beck's Drugs, where people of all walks of life just walked in and spent time together. It's hard to vilify somebody you know. Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote two wonderful books in the 20th century, Moral Man and Immoral Society and The Irony of American Power, understood this. I don't usually tell Barack Obama stories, but everybody likes Barack Obama stories, so I'm going to tell you a quick one because I've got a little time. So I'm playing golf with Barack Obama in the 1990s, and he turns to me without any kind of warning and says, "Tell me everything you know about Reinhold Niebuhr." And I said, "Why do you want to know?" It's not the usual question you get on a golf course. I was a little unprepared, I will tell you. He said, "No, just tell me." And I picked Moral Man and Immoral Society. And what Niebuhr says is that individuals inevitably act morally one-on-one. If you need my help, I'll tell you how to get there. If you need money, I'll probably give it to you. But when they get in groups, that's when you get into trouble, particularly if you don't have communities that tie people together and you're into this identity thing. The problem is, how do you scale it? And God love him, that's what Barack Obama wanted to do. How do you scale the impulse to act morally? You do it in third places. You do it in places where people actually gather, get together, talk with each other, and reestablish those connections that ultimately give you some opportunity to resist the impulse to divide you. Aristotle again said something about this. He said, what happens with regard to democracies when leaders get too much power and the whole collection of things is that they are able to divide the people. And when they divide the people, you've lost it. So the architecture that we need is going to be fact-based. It's going to be also, for lack of a better way of saying, it's going to be landscapes. It's going to be places. It's going to be convenings. It's going to be things that you can do together in a real place. It's going to require people like me not to talk behind the lectern and to move in among you and not be worried that I'm going to embarrass myself or my host for inviting me here because I've walked away from my notes. As I said before, it's always a little nervy to talk to people that need answers about things, and you walk away from your notes. You know, that's a scary thing to do. The first speech I gave in Southeast Asia after seemed like a 5-day flight, I was asked to speak to a group of people about the rule of law. There were 500 people in the room. The reason there were 500 people in the room is they all loved Barack Obama, and they thought, well, okay, I want to hear this guy. It had nothing to do with me. And my staff had prepared, none of whom were lawyers, a wonderful set of talking points on the rule of law. First of hundreds, if not thousands of occasions where they did that. I stood behind the podium. I had my uniform on. I do again today. And I started down through this rule of law talk. And I stopped. And I stepped out from behind the podium. The last time I got behind one of those things, really, I think, except for a couple speeches where I was more careful. And I said, if I can't talk to you about the rule of law without reading it to you, I've got nothing to say to you. And later on, I became friends with the Canadian ambassador to ASEAN and to Indonesia. He said he had never been so frightened for a diplomat in his life when I did that. One day it won't work, and maybe it hasn't worked today, but the fact is you need to be in a conversation with people. You can't be in a space where you're talking at people. I'm not an expert in anything, except maybe some narrow parts of the law. What I am is an observer. What I've done or had the privilege of doing is being in this many, many different spaces, knowing many, many different kinds of people, and now I know some of you that I didn't know before, and that's why I'm here. That makes me more effective, makes me a better person. Let's talk about one last thing before I run out of time, and we're going to do some questions if people have any. Many years ago, I was asked by the provost of Indiana University, I told this story just a moment ago, I wasn't going to talk about it, but I think it's pertinent today, to come to Indiana, it must have been in 2015, to talk to her because, and a group of her faculty members, because she had found $300 million. my kind of place. And she wanted to give it out in 5 or 6 grants to groups of interdisciplinary professors to look at global challenges, whatever they thought they were. So she wanted me to come talk to them about what I thought what they could do. So I went, I don't know, about a week early. I'm from Indiana. And I drove all over southern Indiana. Stopped in parks and talked to people on park benches, some bars. Basically said, what's going on in your world? Now, I'm very comfortable in that space because I'm from there. It's not necessarily a comfortable space for some people if you're not. But I had that advantage. And they talked to me about what was happening in their world. So I went to Indiana that Sunday night, and then the next morning, Monday morning, I went around the campus and talked to some of these groups of lawyers and some famous people. And I saw the provost at the end of the afternoon, and she said, what do you think I got? And I said, I don't think you have very much. And she was a little surprised. She's a friend of mine. So she said, why not? I said, nobody I talked to today has been 10 miles south of here. Every problem we had in Southeast Asia, everything is here. It's not here on the same scale, okay? I mean, we were way ahead of the curve on pandemic exposures. We were trying to put in an early detection system in Southeast Asia in 2010. Nobody was listening to us. But because, and I should have said this because I'm very proud about this piece. I'm not proud of very much. I'm proud about this one. I was the first American diplomat in American diplomatic history to hire a science advisor who was a scientist. Is a scientist. Very Aristotelian of me. So I said to her, nobody's been 10 miles south of here. She said, what would you do? And without ever having thought about it before, because I didn't know what I was going to encounter, I said, I'd invert the university. And she said, well, what's that mean? And I said, why aren't you a resource for the region? Why aren't you the place where people come for answers? Why aren't you helping these communities in all the ways that you can? Now, to her enduring credit, and I give her all credit for this, she got it done. So at Indiana University, there's something called the Center for Rural Engagement. Lilly Foundation, God love them, gave some initial money. Right now, there's 1.5 million student volunteer hours in southern Indiana. All 14 schools at Indiana University are engaged in southern Indiana. The music school is going to band practice with students in some of the high schools, the best music school in the world, by the way. And the law school is helping judges with opinions and research. You name it, they're doing it. Healthcare, leadership, and education, the built environment, water quality, geological survey. The school is all in terms of helping the region. Instead of simply taking in students and turning them back and say, do good things, right? What happens when that happens? What happens is if a mayor or a minister or a student leader or you name it, a business person, if they've got a question, where are they going to go for an answer? They're going to go to Indiana University. It's true that people in Indiana love basketball, and they love the Indiana University basketball team, but they never loved the university because the university was elitist and it was apart from them and all that. Now, the university is a place that's trying to help them. Well, that just changes everything. The university entered into their lives. I'm going to end with this. I met David McCullough, a famous alumnus here, 6 years ago or so, something like that. And I had read his 1994 commencement address, in which he had called for a Marshall Plan for the city of Pittsburgh. It wasn't what we did in Indiana. It wasn't why we did it, but it's very close. And I told David at the time, I said, we did something that is very close to what you thought needed to happen in Pittsburgh. We scaled it. And he said, tell me about it. And I described it to him. It was early days. He said, I want to come. I want to see it. And I said, of course, you can come anytime you want. You let me know. And events overcame it, COVID and health challenges. But why haven't we scaled that? You know, I've had people whose names you would recognize say, well, we could do that in New Hampshire. We could do that, you know, in Arkansas. But why isn't there a network of universities in this country that's saying, you know something? We're going to do this. We're going to look at what the problems are in the surrounding region. We're going to be a resource for that region. You're not going to change the conversation in America. You're not going to change the architecture of democracy unless you deal with people that are remote and not in the factual flow. Those are the facts they need. De Tocqueville said something about Americans, and just repeat this, that it's self-interest properly understood, which is what makes America what it is. We're self-interested, although we joined things, we did, but we understood that he thought it was us understanding our self-interest. We've lost that. People don't understand what's in their self-interest. You remember the famous book not long ago, What's Wrong with Kansas? Well, Kansas doesn't have the facts. There was a famous article, I think it was in Atlantic Magazine, where somebody drove through Kansas and said, if you knew this, would your opinion be different? Yeah, it would be. So we're not giving people the facts they need in order to actually build the conversations we have to essentially have a resistance to this disease that ultimately is pervasive right now, which is we're all just pulling away from each other. We're staying on Zoom. Sorry, don't mean to mention it again. And we've got to get to a place that Pittsburgh got to in its own way initially, when all the leaders of this community built what this was, right? You just have to go down to the Duquesne Club, and however elitist that may be, there was real money put into this place by people who were leaders in the community. And could they have done a better job of it? Could they have done it differently? Yeah, but Carnegie built all those libraries, and other people built all these things. Healthcare officials now are building healthcare facilities, et cetera. We have to get back to having that kind of factual-based, deliberative conversation about how to find a future together. Thank you very much. Zoom, they can't.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we're good? Well, thank you so much for your speech. I really appreciated, especially how much you talked about the built environment. But many of us in this room are students. I'm a 3L, so I'm graduating soon. What actions or career choices can we make to actually contribute to building this new architecture of democracy that's based around facts, based around dialogue, and based around community?
Yeah. I'm going to offer an answer that I feel very deeply about, which is perhaps not very helpful. The thing that struck me in many instances as I've gone about, and I talked to lots of different kinds of groups, okay, about a wide variety of topics, is that you've just got to know about more stuff. You've just got to have a broader perspective on what matters. I mean, you've got to make things matter that people around you will say, why do you care about that? My brother, who's a gifted person, when I was working at Indiana, tried to create this thing with my friend, the provost, said, why are you doing that? The people there don't understand you. They don't share much in common with you. They won't want to listen to all the things you think are important. They don't care about geology or Greek mythology or Aristotle or philosophy. They don't care about any of that. Why are you doing this? And that's sort of the same question I kind of alluded to earlier. Why am I here? Why are we having this conversation? Well, I mean, it's not an easy answer really, but ultimately it has to do with sort of how, it's kind of who is the person you want to be and who do you want to engage? Who do you want to be in touch with? What do you want to understand? Do you want to insulate yourself from the world? Do you want to live in a gated community in Florida? Do you really care? Say, well, it's all going to go to hell anyway, so therefore I got to take care of myself. If you think it's going to go to hell anyway, and you got to take care of yourself, if that's what you really believe, by the way, probably based upon not very much, but let's say you come to that conclusion, then get the best job you can get and earn as much money as you can as quickly as possible. But the problem in your generation right now is that the world is going to continually to roil. And, the job's going to turn over. Yuval Harari wrote 21 Ideas for the 21st Century. And the one thing he said was, be as flexible as you can. Because at the end of the day, the world that is today is not going to be the world there is tomorrow, right? So when I talk about remembering and returning and resurrection and all that, there's a truth to that in terms of finding out where the foundations are. The foundations are in the kinds of things I described. But what builds up from those is going to be really interesting and hard to know. So I'm not talking about the way the world is going to look. I'm talking about what you need to make it look that way, or try to make it something that ultimately is as safe and prosperous as possible. So know as much as you can. And I mean that quite literally. I have a conversation with my brother who I've known 73 years, if you were wondering. And I was talking about the relationship between Van Gogh and foreign policy. I feel very deeply about this topic. And he said, I didn't know you knew anything about art history. And I said, I don't know anything about art history to speak of. That's not the basis of my opinion. And it doesn't matter. I went into what basis of my opinion was with regard to Van Gogh. You would think, well, why does that matter? Because everything you see, you can then integrate into the conversation you need to have. I walked around your campus today. I was looking at the capitals on the columns and what they were. I was looking at the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. I was looking at the Cathedral of Learning and all this stuff. It was all something I had some way to make it into a framework. I made it into a narrative that told me something about the history of this place, how it came to be the way it is. And that matters, because that tells you how the world can be another kind of place in the future. What do you need in order to make it that place? And who do you need? And I promise you, you need all your young people here. That's why I care the fact so deeply that you're here. So.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you very much for especially the answer to that question. That was very interesting. I was wondering, because you were the former ambassador to ASEAN, and I'm sure you brought a lot of your American perspectives there, and I was wondering what you learned there and if any of that could possibly be applicable here in the US. Thank you.
I love getting this question. So before I went out to Southeast Asia, I was called into the State Department by a person whose name you would know, and who had never met me, and said, I thought you were a terrible idea. First words out of his mouth. And I said, don't hold back. And he said, no, I've changed my mind. I think you're a good idea. And he said, because you know the president. And I said, why did you think I was a bad idea? And because I didn't know anything about Southeast Asia, he thought, right? He was wrong about that, by the way. And he said, but I got some advice for you. Go out there, find a few things you care about and you're interested in, and have some wins. And I said to him, I'm not going to do that, which surprised him. And he said, because he was genuinely surprised, he said, why not? And I said, because I don't know what's important. I have no idea what's important. I'm going to find out what's important to them, the people in Southeast Asia. That's why I hired the science advisor. And that's the approach we took. The approach we took was we were students of that era, the area, and what resources could we bring to that? It's the same thing in Indiana. We want to be students of Southern Indiana. I want to be students of what were the problems in Southeast Asia. I'll give you an example. The U.S. government used to fund something called, still does, I hope. Who knows? The Wildlife Trafficking Network. And what it was done, was to interdict, to essentially stop wildlife trafficking in Southeast Asia. It cost $50,000 per country per year. No money. There's 40,000 animals, or there were, in cages in Thailand from that program. taken from smugglers and all that. Why did we care about that? Well, I personally care about that, but that wasn't why we cared about it as a mission. We cared about it because those were the vectors for zoonotic diseases. Those were the vectors for Nipah and Hendra, and although those are not mammals. We were looking at all the infectious pandemic exposures, all the zoonotic viruses and the like, and we were concerned about the trafficking creating a problem for the region, and so we wanted to support that program. ASEAN was going to walk away from it because the United States government was going to stop funding it. 2 countries, not all of them. Which ones? I usually call this out because I'm going to tell you only one of them. Singapore was one of them that was going to drop out. You know, you might. Most people would be surprised by that because it's only $50,000. I won't go into why they were going to drop out. There was another country, a quite poor country, that was going to drop out. And if one of them dropped out, then the whole program was going to stop. And so all that we had done about trying to manage the exposures, the pandemic exposures, which finally came to roost, didn't they? Would have gone away. So the answer to your question is, did I bring an American perspective to it? I don't know if you call that American perspective or not. I brought my perspective to it, which is I don't know anything. And I mean that quite literally. I'm not an expert in anything. But I'm a pretty good listener, and I care about things. I've got a soft heart. And, you know, I believe at the end of the day that people can teach you things that you can then be helpful about. And that's what we tried to do. So much that we feel these days, so much is tied into our own personal identity. You want to be, you want the adulation, or you know, it's the Kardashian thing. You know, it's sort of like, why does this matter to our lives? It has nothing to do with the real problems in the world. The real tragedy of the current political situation is we are doing nothing on the things that are going to most affect us in 10 years or 5 years. And so we're going to get caught up in all of this nonsense. I don't mean nonsense in terms of our system. All this distraction stuff. What do these people who are doing this think they're going to what are we going to do about climate and human migration? And I mean, I got all kinds of things on that if we want to talk about it. We're doing nothing. And these are time-sensitive issues.